Symposium on Gendered Anti-Blackness and Sexuality. It's nice to see so many familiar faces in the attendees list. My name is Dr. Mako Fitzward. I'm the director of the Social Transformation Lab and assistant professor of African American and Women and Gender Studies at Arizona State University. I'm coming to you from the homelands of the Akamel O'odham and Peepash peoples. I pay respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, as custodians of these lands and waterways throughout the generations, and acknowledge the legacies of freedom struggles and solidarity among our Indigenous and Black ancestors. Today, we celebrate Black History Month by paying homage to the radical, transgressive, intellectual explorations of Black rhetorics and culture. This annual celebration goes well beyond prideful festivities of Black life. As Dr. Carter G. Woodson envisioned, this month is about championing Black history in public education across all levels, advancing liberatory visions for Black lives, and demanding economic equity and structural investments in education, health, and reparations for past and continuing harm. I'm excited to moderate our afternoon panel entitled Black Feminist and Queer Practices and Belonging, and introduce you to two dynamic scholars whose work not only celebrates Black cultural production, but pushes us to locate expressions of freedom and liberation across the diaspora. Please post your questions or comments for the panelists during and after their presentations using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now, let me introduce our esteemed panel. Dr. Ashley R. Hall is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at Illinois State University, where she also serves as affiliate faculty for the African American Studies program. She specializes in the study of public discourse, media, and culture. Dr. Hall's research examines the rhetorical significance and power of historical and contemporary rhetorics of Black women. Drawing from divergent strands of Black feminist and womanist theory, Afro-pessimism, Afrofuturism, and Black queer studies, Dr. Hall's research theorizes Black rhetoric as threat, as opposed to as perceived threat, which enables rhetorical scholars to reimagine Black women's imaginative power beyond the brutalizing boundaries of anti-Black violence. Her current research focuses on the development of Afrofuturist feminist rhetorical frameworks equipped to interrogate the complex and nuanced relationship between rhetoric, Blackness, and agentive power as it specifically relates to Black women's communicative lived experiences. Her scholarship has been published in a wide range of outlets, including Contemporary Journal of Rhetoric, Communication Education, and the Quarterly Journal of Speech. Dr. Xavier Liverman is Associate Professor of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies and faculty affiliate with Feminist Studies and Film and Digital Media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He has published widely in the fields of African popular culture and African queer studies. His recent book, Kwaito Bodies, Remastering Space and Subjectivity in Post-Apartheid South Africa, discusses the rise of post-apartheid South African popular culture and its articulation with contemporary politics of race, gender, and sexuality. He is currently working on a project examining Black queer belonging in South Africa. Dr. Hall, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to have the opportunity to be here to breathe through my research today. I think one of the things that's great is there's a lot of connections from some of the presentations earlier today to my presentation. So I'm kind of excited to contribute to the ongoing conversation. I do want to make a note that I have slightly, in my true Aries fashion, made a spontaneous decision to slightly change kind of what I was going to focus on discussing. So the title for the project that I'll present is Breathing Beyond Death, Black Women's Hashtagging, Radical Forms of Care, and the Power of Black, Queer, and Feminist World Making Elsewhere. So I'm just going to kind of jump on in to be mindful of time. My research explores the various ways Black women and girls utilize rhetoric strategically in 3 ways: as a practice of affirmative refusal, as actively queering normative configurations of time and space, and as an energizing spiritual life force. Rhetoric as a means of survival equip Black people with the tools necessary to reconceptualize what thriving can mean for us in and beyond an anti-Black world. To be clear, rhetoric cannot resolve the ontological crisis facing Black people and anti-Blackness. However, it remains a vital tool that generates moments for us to conceptualize lives and futures wherein our subjection is not a requirement. Black queer and feminist employment of rhetorical strategies like storytelling, visuality, and artistic expression actively confront, challenge, and critique Black death as the only future we can access in anti-Blackness. Black queer and feminist rhetorical discourse threaten the status quo by imagining lives for ourselves beyond the confines of white supremacy, Black fungibility, and Black death. The research I present today is a work in progress for a manuscript for the Routledge Handbook of Ethnicity and Race in Communication. So Black women's rhetoric is a threat that actively confronts the truth of Black disposability while simultaneously generating breath, movement, and pathways towards worlds, futures, and lives unknown. Death is only the beginning. Death as origin is a testament to Black queer and feminist beliefs in life after the end of the world. Life beyond the confines of anti-Black brutality and violence is possible. We need only activate ourselves in the present day to devise the kinds of futures we wish to see and deserve to experience. To breathe beyond death is to breathe in love through radical forms of care wherever we are. As a Black queer woman rhetorician, I strive to amplify the everyday, mundane, and creative pathways Black women and girls, both past but present and living presently, as well as future, cultivate via our labor, communication, and movement. Christina Sharp's monograph, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, has been influential in reframing how I approach Black feminist rhetorical cultures and their capacity to reimagine care for Black women and girls amid precarity. In collaborating with Black critical theorists and my ancestral heritage, I'm afforded opportunities to reconceptualize critique as a radical form of care that empowers us and fills us as we move towards livable futures beyond neonatal alienation. Black scholars, writers, and creatives like Audre Lorde, Horton Spillers, Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and Sylvia Winter remind me that the birth of the human is not where and when Black agentive power originates. Our ancestral essence exists beyond the linear spatial temporalities of anti-Blackness, a knowing of the world in new and in impossible ways elsewhere. In drawing breath from and with our ancestors, we can learn from and lean on them as spiritual power sources that remind us of who we are and where we come from, which, to be clear, isn't here. This rhetorical elsewhere refers to the time and space we create through our refusal to accept death as our only inheritance. I'm invested in the ways our rhetorical practices signal toward life elsewhere, worlds that exist even if, for now, they only exist in our minds and spiritual bodies. The directional horizons I reference, beyond and toward, contextualize my reimagination of Black women and girls' agency as an ancestral inheritance and sacred power that is quite literally not of the known, thus colonized and conquered world. These directives aren't propositions that ask us to ignore the material realities of anti-Black violence, nor are they encouraging a forgetting of trauma as well as the joy we've experienced. Rather, these directives invite us to let go of disposability and death as all we'll ever know. To breathe towards a beyond that is elsewhere requires a belief in an ancient and unapologetic love for Black women and girls. As Black women and girls have demonstrated and affirmed for centuries, we are from the future. There is no future beyond without us. Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work confirms and affirms my belief in the possibility of life and breath after the end of the world. An end of the world, but not the end of life. Rather, it is an end of life as we currently know it. As a queer Black troublemaker, Black feminist evangelist, time traveler, and space cadet, her work imagines the death of anti-Black capitalist relations through archival practice and poetic speculation. moves that invite us to sit with and breathe with our ancestors. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Ida B. Wells movements in the 19th century, America, for instance, hold space for future generations of Black women and girls like me to dream in spite of the violent conditions we navigate, as they did. To speculate beyond and dream of new worlds, I must actively confront the truth of Black disposability. We currently inhabit a world built upon and sustained by Black disposability, a reality predicated on the belief that we are disposable commodities whose only purpose is to propagate the myth of white supremacy, white civility, and American democratic freedom as our origins. To envision otherwise worlds for me requires an unapologetic accounting of the violent conditions positioning Black women and girls in intimate proximity to state-sponsored violence. What I refer to as state-sponsored violence is violence that acknowledges and names the multidimensional nature of anti-Black, misogynoristic violence that Black women and girls navigate. Ma'Khia Bryant and Corinne Gaines' stories spotlight the wanton violence we navigate in our everyday lives. A young Black mother and a young Black girl whose murders at the hands of the state are ridiculed, with many debating whether Corinne and Ma'Khia are to blame for their own murders. Social media commentators debated on what Ma'Khia and Corinne could have done and should have done to avoid being murdered. Yet we know that there is no way to prevent the violence that looms over our everyday lives in an anti-Black world. Thus, the debates allow for anti-Black misogynoir to continue gaining legitimacy, perpetuating hegemonic narratives that Black women and girls are not innocent and therefore are deserving of the violence we experience. This is what care for Black women and girls currently looks like, feels like, and sounds like in an anti-Black world, that is, the known world. When cis heterosexual Black men are murdered, there is legitimate outrage in our communities. When Black women and girls are murdered, there are questions and multiple sides to the stories. When Black, queer, non-binary, and trans folk are murdered, there is a resounding silence. All deserve outrage, however, we do not all receive the same energy. Yet we, Black women and girls, straight and queer, cis and trans, are still expected to show up, rage out, and mule for everyone other than ourselves. So when cishet Black men like Stephon Clark tweet anti-Black comments regarding Black women and babies prior to his premature death, we are still expected to speak out, show up, and set shit off. Unsurprisingly, prior to his murder, Clark also endorsed his non-Black partners' anti-Black messages hurled at belittling Black women. Following Clark's murder by Sacramento PD, Black women who stated they had no interest in protesting on his behalf were deemed foul and petty. On public platforms like The Grapevine, a mediated roundtable created for Black millennials to discuss pressing issues facing our Black communities, Clark's comments were deemed insignificant to state violence, as if anti-Black misogynoir in and outside of our communities doesn't traumatize and murder Black women and girls. It is the prioritization of cishet Black men within Black communities that participate in the normalization of wanton violence against women, femmes, and girls as justified. This is why, for example, Black feminist cultural critic Jamila Lemieux initiated hashtag Black Power is for Black Men. As Lemieux's hashtag implies, we deserve more. We deserve better. This is why we scream hashtag free Cece. This is why we say hashtag me too. This is why we say hashtag say her name. This is why we shout hashtag mute R. Kelly. This is why we demand hashtag Black Lives Matter. We are hashtag Black Girl Magic personified. Social media for Black, queer, and feminist folks provide platforms for us to intervene on our own behalf. I build on Rico Self and Maya's essay on digital resistance and memory making via social media to inform my conceptualization of hashtagging as a Black, queer, and feminist world-making practice. Jogging, as explained by Rico Self and myself, consider how social media hashtag communication embodies Black, queer, and feminist world-making in its digital form. Quote, jogging is one way in which Black women actualize and mobilize an ethic of care rooted in Black feminist politics of love, collaboration, and creativity, end quote. The use of hashtags is wielded as a social justice tool, communicating a refusal to let the memory of Black women and girls die in the public sphere. Jogging, as evidenced through hashtag justice for Breonna Taylor, disrupts hegemonic narratives routinely erasing, shaming, and blaming Black women and girls for the violence imposed upon us. Many tweets sarcastically and emotionally critiqued the structural modalities of violence as they questioned the number of days passed without justice, let alone accountability for Breonna's murder. Jogging through hashtags as a call to action, as an invitation, and as a rallying cry worked to shift us towards models of care rooted in a radical and unequivocal love for Blackness as an intersectional life force. Hashtagging, as a Black queer and feminist world-making practice, generates and holds spaces online and offline for Black women and girls to speculate wholeness, wellness, and possibility beyond ontological terror. A simple hashtag like hashtag justice for Breonna Taylor just gestures towards an affirmative refusal to let the memory of Black women and girls be forgotten. Hashtagging does not stop or resolve anti-Black violence. It's true. It does, however, create avenues and pathways for us through chaos toward building life elsewhere. Black queer and feminist world-making involves being intentional about how we move through time and space to show and actualize care for Black women and girls. Hashtagging via social media platforms amplify, model, and embody generative forms of care that demand we shift how we have conversations about intimate state violence and how we actualize generative care offline. As an embodied praxis, hashtagging creates pathways towards elsewhere, in part by mapping the normative flow of anti-Black capitalist power relations in intimate state violence. Moya Bailey states, quote, "I argue that the silence and erasure of violence Black women and girls endure are connected to society's inability to see us as worthwhile subjects deserving of respect and care," end quote. The utilization of hashtags as Black, queer, and feminist sites of critical refutation and affirmation push and extend conversations about Black care beyond anti-Black grammars of suffering. Barely living is no longer the standard for our care. Hashtag UOKSIS creator Feminista Jones embraces the creative power and potential that lies within intersectional in the ideological spectrum of Black feminist thought. Jones proclaims, quote, "Black feminism is the key to Black liberation. It offers a better pathway to the promise of Black people's liberation from centuries of systemic race-based oppression," end quote. In thinking through hashtagging as world-making practice, I understand Black women's hashtags as rhetorical forms of care that actively work to build new worlds grounded in a Black queer and feminist ethos of radical love. Care reimagined isn't accepting more of the same shit packaged as something different. Care is confronting and shifting away from normative power structures and logics to create new and rival ways of actualizing care as a transformational life praxis. Care is attending to the ways Black women and girls experience intimate state violence and actualizing interventions on and offline. Black queer and feminist-driven hashtags are sources that offer us maps and cultivate lexicons to envision care beyond violent submission towards fruitful collaboration. In listening to Black women and girls' stories and public critiques, I argue our rhetorical movement via hashtagging generates opportunities to reimagine care, as Christina Sharp suggests, as a, quote, antidote to violence, end quote, rather than care as violent conditioning. Care, as I employ it here, echoes Alexis Pauline Gumb's belief in the presence of love amidst chaos. Quote, "Love is there. My study of Black women has taught me that. Love is always there, always, even when it seems completely impossible that it would be," end quote. Love, a radical Black, queer, and feminist ethos and world-making practice, is the driving creative and spiritual life force that encourages Black women and girls to clap back and to dream beyond the fixed boundaries of ontological terror. For the rest of my time today, I will focus on Black feminist-oriented critiques on social media surrounding hashtag Mute R. Kelly as representative of how Black women's hashtagging operates as a rhetorical form of care. The news of R. Kelly's conviction and the nature of his charges sparked old debates on and offline about Kelly being railroaded by the criminal justice system. This railroading language is intentional as it weaponizes Black men's violent history with the state to shame and silence Black women and girls. The message? Save cishet Black men at all costs. One Black woman tweeted, quote, "The definitive proof that a big chunk of the Black community does not respect or even like Black girls and women, just look at the responses to R. Kelly's trial. Like they're asking about redemption of a man who exploited Black girls repeatedly for at least 30 years. Hashtag R. Kelly verdict," end quote. Unpacking her thoughts about the surviving R. Kelly docuseries, Jamel Hill laments, quote, "As awful as those accounts are, what's more haunting is the resignation in these women's voices. They seem to have arrived at the painful conclusion that regardless of the trauma they have endured, their experience would never matter the way it should have," end quote. Hill's sadness for Black survivors who do not seek justice or accountability for intimate state violence is not a hyperbolic drama. It is the manifestation of compounded trauma. Through the race traitor frame, bolstered by the adultification and criminalization of Black girls, we are constantly socialized to believe that we do not matter and that we are not worthy of state or communal protection. It is Hill's sadness that contextualizes and reinforces the importance of movements like hashtag Say Her Name and hashtag New R. Kelly, because they exist to disrupt, critique, and shift away from toxic anti-Black narratives towards possibilities beyond punitive care. In refusing to accept silence and violence as the only forms or kinds of care accessible to and for us, hashtag New R. Kelly co-founder Oranike Odeleye says, quote, "We need to do so much of a better job of really listening to our sisters and checking the ego and some of the kind of training we've all had. You know, our needs aren't being met and we're socialized to be strong and soldier on, to stand up for our brothers that we often don't stand up for ourselves. And I think we're seeing a shift now in our culture with Me Too and a lot of these movements of Black women saying, hold up, no more," end quote. Upon the news of the R. Kelly verdict hitting the internets, Black feminist Trevor Lindsay amplifies the power of the hashtag New R. Kelly and hashtag Surviving R. Kelly movements as she addresses how R. Kelly was able to abuse Black women and girls for 30 years. Speaking directly to the underage Black girl at the center of Kelly's 2008 child pornography court case, she says, quote, "Too many people have treated her as though she wasn't a person who warranted our care or concern. She was maligned as fast, deemed hypersexual, and adultified, implying that she didn't need the same care, support, or protection afforded to white children and teenagers. She was the butt of jokes. She was a punchline for those more interested in making fun of R. Kelly for his sexual proclivities than pondering whether R. Kelly was likely a sexual predator," end quote. Here, Lindsay names the anti-Black misogynistic tropes and narrative framings that normalize the pain and suffering of young Black girls. The young Black girl who was raped and peed on camera, shared for the entire world to see, was treated as an object for entertainment, to be used up. She was not seen as a human worthy of protection by Kelly, and thus many responses to the video failed to prioritize this young girl's pain. To have your abuse treated as a punchline for popular culture jokes and your abuser lauded for keeping himself forever young through his preference for adult teens speaks volumes about the punitive care we receive in anti-Blackness. In response to the treatment of Black girls' pain, hashtag Solidarity is for White Women creator Mickey Kendall contends that, quote, "Nobody cared because it was Black girls," end quote. To see the humor, quote unquote, in R. Kelly's audacity is to violate and abuse an underage Black girl on videotape, requires folks to disassociate R. Kelly himself from the violence and trauma left in his wake. The joke is funny because Black girls' pain is not acknowledged or recognized in these comedic frames. It is the adultification of Black girls reiterated by Lindsay as hypersexual Jezebels plotting to take good brothers down that validates anti-Black misogynoir. Lindsay's naming of systems and communities that treat Black girls as punchlines rather than precious babies deserving protection is an instance of care as she affirmatively refuses the objectification, exploitation, and dehumanization that dismiss our pain and suffering as merely comical. Hashtag Mute R. Kelly co-founder Kenyette Barnes speaks to the interconnectedness of intimate and state violence, saying, quote, "Sexual violence in the Black community is a gender problem," end quote, a problem that Oranike Odeleye refuses to take on as our problem. Quote, "You cannot put anything else on my back. I am not a mule. I need help. I need resources. You're going to listen to my problems. And when I ask for justice, I'm not going to stop until I get it. There is nothing we can do without our sisters being there whole and healthy and supported and loved. And so we need to be having a different conversation just as a community of how we treat Black women and how we see and value Black women," end quote. Naming sexual violence in the Black community as a systemic issue is a gesture that communicates the necessity to reconceptualize care that acknowledges the intersectional lived experiences of Black women and girls. The conversations initiated by Black feminists surrounding hashtag New R. Kelly, as well as hashtag Surviving R. Kelly and hashtag the R. Kelly verdict, generate space to critique existing forms of care that silence and shame Black women and girls as truth tellers who refuse to play along and to joke about the reality of anti-Black misogynoir. The rhetorical power of hashtagging lie in the threat it poses to anti-Black grammars of suffering through intersectional frames of Blackness. Frames that expose, as Kimberly Crenshaw puts it, quote, "conventional fault lines between race and gender and justice that have shielded behavior like Kelly's, permitting an intraracial closing of ranks and an interracial resolve to look away, end quote. In affirming the power of Black women's hashtagging, it is vital we do not reduce our lives and worth to hashtags. Hashtag MeToo founder Tarana Burke believes that, quote, healing as community-based requires we listen to Black survivors and that we go beyond the hashtag to realize we are people deserving of love and protection and safety, end quote. We are more than hashtags. Thus, it's about what these hashtags enable us to do offline. Celebrating the 4th anniversary of hashtag MeToo, activist cultural organizer Raquel Willis reiterates Burke's urgency, saying, quote, to go beyond the hashtag is a call for action, for championing survivors and fighting against sexual violence in our everyday lives. And I believe in particular that we must champion the often overlooked experiences of queer and trans people in the realm of sexual violence. Let's build the world that we all deserve, end quote. Hashtagging demands we think of care differently beyond anti-Black grammars to move us towards worlds elsewhere wherein love and support for Black women and girls is the foundation of living otherwise. Critiques as a rhetorical form of care is one means by which we can strive towards livable futures for Black women, or for Black people, Black women and girls in particular. Moving forward with this project, I work to develop this notion of truth-telling critique as generative care, as sites through which I theorize Black women and girls' agenda power beyond intimate state violence elsewhere. Black women like Oronike Odeleyi, Kenya Barnes, as well as Tarana Burke's hashtag movements help us shift how we actualize care for Black women and girls via tweets and out here in the real world streets. Hashtagging isn't solely about movement online. It encompasses and is empowered by community and movement building offline that holds space simultaneously for the dialogues we have online. The hashtag Mute R. Kelly movement on and offline amplifies and embodies love and care for Black women and girls through coordinated organizing and collaborative efforts to build worlds our hashtagging holds space for us to imagine. Thus, I continue to explore the rhetorical implications of Black women's movement on and offline, to consider how these dynamics constitute rhetorical cultures, committing to confronting the truth of Black disposability, while simultaneously building towards new worlds and futures beyond anti-Black terror. In accounting for what hashtagging practices enable us, we can learn and let go of the known world to speculate about worlds and impossibilities that we have yet to discover. We need only breathe in a radically reimagined love for Blackness as intersectional that can move us beyond death towards life and possibilities elsewhere. Thank you.
Dr. Liverman, you're up next.
Sorry, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen share together. So if you just give me a minute, sorry about that delay. It'll just take a second. So thank you first and foremost to the School of Social Transformation, African American Studies, and all of the faculty, staff, and students who were involved in putting this together. I also thank everybody for coming here today and being a part of the community that we're creating here and the conversation that we're creating here. I will just preface all of this by stating that this particular set of observations are based on a set of long-running projects that I've had that I'm basically trying to kind of figure out where I want to go with and how I can kind of pull some of these thought processes together. It connects to my interest in questions of belonging and Black queer belonging in particular on a global scale. Although this particular set of reflections will be based on my work in South Africa. I also want to just share my appreciation for Dr. Hall's presentation because I think that my own presentation also deals with these questions of the otherwise and the elsewheres and reimaginations and kind of thinking through society in a different way. using different forms of cultural production. So I hope that we can think about some of the synergy between our works, even as they're quite different. So as I mentioned, I'm interested in this question of queer belonging as part of a larger project in Black queer belonging, in particular in the South African context, where I'm really interested in how Black queer folks in the South Africa negotiate ideas of belonging and exclusion, particularly in the realm of shifting cultural attitudes towards the Black queer community in South Africa. And part of this builds on my larger work that kind of thinks through what safety and security and notions of love and belonging and acceptance looks like for Black queer community members, and that a lot of times the state can do work towards that kind of recognition, but that there are certain kinds of limits to state recognition that I think end up having to be resolved at the level of community, right? And of course, that can be both problematic in a neoliberal sense, right? Of kind of shunting off, um, you know, the labors of the state onto to communities, but it can also be productive as a way of thinking about community care, as a way of thinking through how we resolve some of these issues of violence and how we create a bit more of a life affirming experience for queer folk in South Africa, and Black queer folk, of course, is my focus here. So I wanted to get to this concept of belonging and where I'm drawing it from. I think it's important because for me, the concept of belonging is about this aspect of societal relation that expands beyond kind of the political notions of citizenship, and offers up, I think, a sort of richer, thicker description. And so the idea of belonging is, for me, is developed from Mickey Van Ziel's 2009 discussion of the limits of rights, language, and discourse for queer South Africans. She states that belonging is a thick concept which includes affective and cultural elements, making visible the limitations of citizenship through contextualizing the politics and power dynamics in discourses of human rights. It also allows us to focus on the everyday dynamics of oppression, which form the bedrock of marginalization and othering. Right. So I'm interested in this idea of belonging as sort of offering um, this sort of more expansive description of Black queer life and possibility. And as I said, this idea of belonging came out of the way to sort of speak about the real limits of national recognition, on the limitations of constitutional protection, and et cetera, so that it was a way of helping people to think through some of the disconnects between a very progressive liberal legal framework that was operating in South Africa and the reality of lived experience on a day-to-day basis for a lot of Black queer people, in which they were not protected, they were not affirmed, they were not given opportunities, right? All these things that are supposed to be happening at the scale of law, but are in fact not happening in an everyday situation. So I think that belonging kind of helps us to think through those kinds of disconnects. Just to kind of give some ideas about how I'm thinking through belonging, drawing from this particular activist formation, is that what then happens is that belonging, sort of somewhat in contrast to more human rights oriented law, is not individualistic, but it's communal and contextual. There's always a focus on the cultural, the affective, and contextualization of power dynamics. There's a focus on the dynamics of everyday oppression, and it allows us to focus on questions of safety, security, equality, dignity, and respect for difference, right? And what I'm trying to do here is just to think about, like, here are the components of this concept that I want to try to take through and examine in different elements of South African life. So before I kind of jump into the way that I see belonging playing out in the South African context and my interest in thinking through it, I do want to just add the caveat that that some of the language around belonging can seem to reproduce the language of normativity, right? And I want to think about what are some of the limits to that kind of Northern discourse on homonormativity being kind of imposed into a global South framework. And what I'm saying here is that is not that there aren't in certain queer movements in South Africa a desire for certain forms of normativity, right? I acknowledge that, but that I don't want to just simply say, okay, a desire for belonging on the part of Black queer Africans in their countries of origin is necessarily a desire for a certain kind of normative queer subject that becomes acceptable, viable, and visible for the state and for kind of corporations, right? Instead, I want us to think about the ways that a desire for belonging would require a reimagination, right? And a rethinking and a kind of otherwise and a kind of elsewhere, right? Of a lot of these sort of cultural, societal, and political norms. And so that there would be something potentially transformative that would have to happen if the kind of belonging that queer folks are seeking out and striving for is actually meaningful, right? For the sort of most vulnerable members of the queer community. So one of the ways that this gets discussed very vividly and contentiously in the South African context is through this notion of tradition. And I always want to keep in mind that when we speak about tradition in an African context, we are always thinking about this through the notion of tradition as constructed, right? The notion of tradition as mediated by colonialism, capitalism, neo-colonialism, and so forth, right? So that we don't see it in these sort of very static ways. But I think at the same time, part of the tension around these questions of tradition is a kind of tension between those who would mobilize tradition for very ossified and static purposes that often uphold gendered and sexual hierarchies, right? And those that see tradition as a lived tradition, right? And therefore consistently open, consistently available to be repackaged or reimagined, right? And rethought. And it's in that, and it's that rethinking, that repackaging, that reimagination that I'm really interested in my work, because I think that's where we see forms of Black queer agency. That's where we see Black queer people not simply being victims, right, of society or victims of a state that won't and can't provide for them, right? But we see instead of a way that Black queer people sort of work in and through the set of constraints that they're offered. Also, as I speak about tradition, one of the things that I also want to just point out is that I don't offer this up with the understanding that the majority of Black queer people are interested in thinking through tradition in relationship to their Black queerness, right? There is, there are a lot of people who aren't interested in these questions. They're not interested in linking their queerness with any sort of notion of African cultural resonance, right? But I want to think about, for those people who are interested in that connection, why this gesture toward tradition is important. And I think it is often important precisely because it does push back, complicate, and destabilize the sort of wearying and yet constant argument of un-Africanness connected to queer practices around gender and sexuality. So in order to think through these questions of what that queering tradition is like, I kind of bring up two examples that I've explored in my work. One, I'm kind of working through currently as we talk. The other is one that I've kind of worked on before. So first, I had wanted to show y'all just a video clip from the film Inkeba, which was the film itself. I mean, there are two ways to kind of think through these questions, one of which is on the level of the filmic text itself, and the other on the level of the discourse that the film created. And of course, I'll do a little bit of both, but I'm really interested in the latter, right? Like, what is the discourse that gets created? Why did Black queer people identify so strongly with this film? And why was this such an important moment for Black queer communities to, in a particular way, sort of insert themselves into a particular kind of discourse around tradition? So I'm going to try to see if I can do this switcheroo really quickly to just get us to the point of being able to see this. Okay. I am hoping that are people able to hear?
Dala! Ithi ndindoda! 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 Ndindoda!
Uzahlala pha efikweni ngithiphele iminutes 8 ne? Umkhwetha ngasela imanzi, umkhwetha kangadli. Okunjalo ke nakuthi. Uhlala pha.
Evoye ubona Xolani ntanga zethu.
Abantu bakunike abathathu kule game.
Jonga apha, ndizawuthanda uba ke uqinise isandla kule ntwana yam. Ya, le ntwana icwela ubhetyebhetye mani, icwela ubethe-ethe le ntwana.
Ngoku buyela ntoni kule ndawo? Ngoku ayuzikhumbula iitshomi zakho okanye ubona uba unatshomi apha. Okanye itsheri yakho. Ndiyakubona uba uyintoni, kodwa wena theni ngakho kuyivume loo nto.
Uyavuma. Uzongcolisa isiko wena pha.
Utsho njani akhangathi?
Kwetha!
Xa fika esiXhoseni, akho sithetha izinto zalapha. Yintoni mkhwetha?
So I'm going to try to switch back so you can see the slides again. So let me do that, and hopefully sorry about that. So basically, as the slides are sort of coming back, what the film does is it creates this scenario whereby the main characters interact with one another at a school of initiation, which is in a sort of rural area of South Africa. And this initiation school includes, a circumcision ceremony, but its most important aspect is as a rite of passage. And so much of the debate in the South African context was around, was it appropriate to sort of suggest or insinuate that queerness could be a part of this particular cultural practice? And of course, given that it is a kind of single sex gender space, right? One would argue that, of course, certain kinds of intimacies and queerness would arise, but there was this tension between the film that presented this sort of expansive understanding of queerness within a sort of African cultural construct, and people who were generally heteropatriarch, cishet, Xhosa men. This is a practice that tends to be associated with people from the Xhosa ethnicity, who basically said, no, this was not possible, right? And part of what the film does is it constructs a tension between the Kwanda character, who is from the city of Johannesburg and represents sort of an urbane Western understanding of queerness, and the two caretakers, Vija and Kolani, who are kind of represented as having this queer relationship that doesn't correspond in any kind of neat way, right? To kind of Western categorizations and understandings of queerness. And the interesting thing about the film is that the film offers up these two different versions of Black queerness, and suggests that they can live, right, and operate simultaneously in this space of kind of intimacy between men, right, through this initiation school. And yet it undoes all of that work by having Kolani kill Kwanda, right? Sorry for the spoilers, folks, if you want to watch it, but having Kolani kill Kwanda, right, at the end as a way to kind of preserve a certain kind of discretion and secrecy around his relationship with Vija, right? And so what we get is this sort of the film sort of being extremely ambivalent about these different interpretations of queerness. But what happened in outside the film, right, and what happened in the conversations and community was often reduced to like, is queerness something that should be there or not, right? And I think that the film offered an opportunity for Black queer folks, particularly Black queer men, to insist on their presence in these practices, their presence in these cultural scripts, right? And to insist that these aspects of culture actually did create a space for queerness to emerge. Even though, of course, the whole point of the initiation ceremony is to sort of create a normative masculine subject. So the other aspect of this is something that I wrote about previously, which is around queer practitioners of traditional religions in the South African context. And I just wanted to pull this quote because I also wanted to think through queer women's experiences and how traditional religions often become a space for Black queer women to sort of imagine themselves as cultural subjects in particular kinds of ways. And so this quote from Nkunzi Kabinde, who wrote this autobiography about their experiences as a lesbian sangoma, as a lesbian traditional healer, I think is really important. So they say here, in traditional Zulu culture, a man must be a man and do male things, and a woman must be a woman and do female things. But with sangomas, it is far more flexible. I can dance like a woman and wear a woman's clothes, and dance like a man and wear a man's clothes. I can do the work of a man, like slaughtering a goat or a cow. Although in traditional Zulu culture, a woman cannot slaughter. And so I pulled this quote because it is part of what makes, I think, these traditional practices attractive, right? They become a script, a narrative, a form of discourse, a materiality, right? That Black queer people can latch onto as a way of thinking through certain ways that gender and sexuality may have been more fluid prior to the oncoming of Christianity and colonialism, right? And then this is sort of an empowering move. And of course, there's limitations to that, which I'll get to in a moment. And I'm gonna just skip through this really quickly in the interest of time, but I also do a lot of work on thinking through the queering of space and how heterosexual spaces can become queered, right, through the kinds of cultural labors and practices that queer people engage in those spaces to sort of queer those leisure spaces. And my my example of that was from the performance art group Faga. And they say in their quote that Faga in Zulu literally means to penetrate or occupy, and that they have conceptualized their artistic practice as a way to occupy spaces that exclude Black queer people in South Africa. And so, as I said, I want to think really critically about, you know, what are the limitations to these desires for a certain kind of inclusion, right? But at the same time, I don't want to poo-poo these desires for inclusion and belonging. And this is just a fabulous picture of Faga. If I had more time, I'd talk a bit more about them, but I'm gonna leave that for Q&A if people want to know more. To conclude, I just want to think through, as I said, some of those tensions around belonging that I'm trying to think through, which are tensions between forms of belonging and desires to build them, and those who sort of reject belonging, right, who are more interested in sort of forms of disbelonging, right, of being outside, of not being included, right? And therefore belonging offers both these sort of possibilities and these limitations, right? These possibilities for thinking otherwise, for thinking elsewhere, for imagining differently, but also potentially certain kinds of limitations in that what you're attempting to reimagine or rework may need to be dismantled altogether, right? Like belonging may not be enough to resolve some of the tensions of Black queer exclusions, violences, lack of material, you know, comfort and so forth, you know, susceptibility to premature death and so forth. So I think with that, I will conclude, and I look forward to any questions and comments that folks may have.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Liverman and Dr. Hall, for your provocative presentations. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, comments, or I think I always like to see words of affirmation. We are in a space, as you all could probably tell from this morning, these kinds of spaces are practices of community making, place making, and in some cases, institutional place taking, right? And so please feel free to post affirmations, words of support and care in the Q&A box. So let's get our conversation going by talking a little bit about love. So as you were both presenting, I was thinking a lot about the connections to Black feminist discourses on love and the erotic, especially given Dr. Miller-Young's presentation this morning on pornography. In the book, All About Love, New Visions, the late, now ancestor, Bell Hooks, says, quote, true love does have the power to redeem, but only if we are ready for redemption. Love saves us only if we want to be saved. So what do you think the power of witnessing Black queer love, more specifically love making in all of its many forms, from romantic, platonic to erotic, what are some of what's the power of witnessing lovemaking practices and really those practices as advancing free queer world making?
I haven't really thought about that. So I'm going to start by saying this is all very like on the top of my head. Um, just kind of quick thoughts. But I mean, I think there's a very long tradition, as you've pointed out, where of love as some sort of political act, right? That has the possibility to kind of free. And I think as long as that's grounded, I think in certain kinds of frameworks for material redress and change, I'm all for it. I think there are times where it can sometimes devolve into like a neoliberal, you know, self-care almost type routine or communal, like type thing. And so I think that, yes, it is something that's transformative, and clearly, like in the case of, the context that I'm working in, and there's clearly like a love for Black queerness and Black queer community that desires it to be recognized and seen in particular kinds of ways, right? And that love in many ways, motivates the artistic work, but also the activist work. But I also want to just make sure that call for care, basically, right, is not disconnected from calls for certain kinds of material changes in reality, right? I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I definitely, to kind of continue that conversation. For me, for the longest, I kind of, I would hear folks talking about love, and I was like, if you don't get that shit out of here, like, what is that gonna do for us? Where does that take us? And I think that it engaging, Audre Lorde, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and kind of this very material yet immaterial way to think about love as a life force that pushes us, that encourages us, that invites us to think differently, to act differently, to interact differently. I think that's where, when I'm thinking about radical forms of care and modeling care in different ways, it's a love that allows or provides that foundation for us to be able to think and do differently. And so I think witnessing, those kinds of Black and queer love, right, in some ways is a confirmation of the confrontations that are happening, right? Witnessing kind of helps stimulate possibilities where possibilities aren't presumed to exist, especially if we think about, white cis heteronormative scripts that organize kind of configurations of time and space in an anti-Black world, that socialize and condition us to not think about imagination, to not think about creative expression as manifestations of love, that again allow us to think about worlds beyond where we're socialized to believe there is no end. And I think when we think about this idea of love in this Black, queer, and feminist tradition, it's a reminder, right, that love predates anti-Black violence in this kind of colonial known world, and it will exist far beyond it. And so the elsewhere that I'm referring to is, this future love that we can bring into the present to move us toward that future where it always already exists.
Yes, yes, yes to all of that. So Dr. Marlon Bailey posted a question in the chat. He says, 1, excellent presentation. Dr. Liverman, what does your work tell us about Black queer belonging diasporically? How can we imagine same-sex intimacy and belonging diasporically that do not map onto LGB identities necessarily?
Yeah, thank you for that observation. I just like to add that I also like, and Ashley, just in, I'm sorry, Dr. Hall, in your last comments, that also reminded me a lot of like Robinson's take on Black Marxism, right? And that there's this sort of predating, right, to the current world that we have. And therefore that's, an impetus for the kinds of like actions that we have as Black folk have taken to try to shift and create our freedom, right? So I thought that was a nice synergy. So with respect to Dr. Bailey's question, I think the first thing that I would say is that, and I wish I could have gotten it through a little more clearly when I was talking about the film, but it feels to me that what the film offers up is this example of 2 Black queer men engaged in now we can talk about the limitations of that intimacy and the way that it gets portrayed in the filmic text, but who are intimate with one another while not naming their practices under a kind of LGB identificatory claim, right? And in some cases, not even kind of imagining that kind of global gay, if we want to call it that, right, framework for how they engage their bodies and sexualities, right? And so what is disturbing to me, I think, is the presentation of that kind of framework as somehow unmodern, or somehow it will be superseded by a kind of Western global gay framework, right? So that, so I think that I do want us to push back against, I think, a kind of development studies framework of queerness diasporically, that, things will all eventually look like something that we see in a kind of white Western context. It's not there yet, but give it time, right? And I think that that's what I'm trying to push against, right? Is that and I think that what it also helps us reveal in the US context, or in the kind of global hegemon context, right? If you're in the UK or France or whatever, is that there've always been these other kinds of queerness that don't map onto Western LGBT identities, right? They may be more explicitly able to be named, right? And cataloged, let's say, in a kind of diasporic sense, but we have them here, right? And that's why, and I think, Dr. Bailey, some of your work, of course, speaks to that, right? Like, speaks to the sort of inability of a Western LGBT framework to contain, right, the sort of diversity of Black queerness. So I think that's where I'll stop there.
Great. So we have a question from Dr. Orr to Dr. Hall. Could you speak more on chaos? Specifically, how do you define chaos and map its generative and transformative power?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Thanks. So for me, the way that I kind of interpret chaos is thinking about the ontological kind of parameters in which anti-Black violence is taking place, right? So it's material, it's cultural, it's spiritual, it's personal. And, thinking about the messiness in terms of when we talk about world making, right? Different folks are going to have different conceptions as to what world making means. And so for me, that's also a part of the chaos, because as Black people, we're not a monolith, right? So we're not always going to agree as to what the worlds that we want to live in actually look like, sound like, and feel like. But for me, that's part of the mapping that happens in wanting to study Black women's Black, queer, and feminist rhetorical cultures, to think about the various ways that world making, or creating new worlds, or memory making and space making can actually open up. And so when we talk about chaos, we're talking about anti-Black misogynoir, right? We're talking about intimate state violence. We're talking about cis heteronormativity. We're talking about all of these systems and all of these forces and processes that create a number of tensions for Black folks to decide, how are we going to survive, right? But then comes the question for me, is survival enough, right? And I'm kind of at a juncture and thinking about my work where survival is not enough, right? But it's wanting to barely survive that contributes also to the chaos, because there's this kind of presume that there is a limitation around the kinds of choices that we can make. And so wanting to map the ways that folks communicate about the choices that they're making, and thinking about the limitations of those choices, as well as potentially what those choices communicate and the language or the lexicon that it opens us up to start thinking differently about worlds and lives elsewhere can actually mean for us. And so for me, that's the generative power of hashtagging. Is like, when you think about online and hashtags, it's messy as hell, right? And not everyone who's using these hashtags is using them in a generative, transformative way. And so I think this even goes back to the question about love. It can't be a producing more of the same kind of love, right? Within the context or confines of anti-Black grammars, it has to be, right, something different, right? Thinking differently about what it means to connect and to interact with other folks. And of course, like, as I said, that's a messy process. There are Black women on Twitter, right, who aren't necessarily using it in generative and transformative ways. But I still think in that messiness and in that tension, right, is an opportunity for us to transform what it means to be agents and to understand the responsibility that comes along with that.
Mm-hmm. And as a follow-up to that, there's a question from one of our doctoral students, Felicia Colquette, that's very much connected to some of my own recent work on Black women's biopolitics and biopolitical agency. So she asked this question about the refusal to accept death as an end for Black women. And is surviving or choosing life in and of itself a means of refusing Black folks' social death or unhumanness? So is choosing life a radical politic for Black people, and more particular, in particular, Black queer folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, without trying to romanticize it to a degree where, it kind of just is something that inherently happens, I think it's an intentional choice to choose life in a particular way, right? Because again, we're trying to create distinctions between reproducing more of the same normative belonging, if you will, thinking of Dr. Liverman's presentation, versus reimagining what belonging can actually mean, what it can look like, and what it can feel like. And so choosing life, I think, is important, but it's also important to think about, how do you want to live? Which is why it goes back to this idea that for me, surviving is not enough, right? It's not to say that surviving is meaningless, right? We understand that we live in this particular context in which the world, this new world, the known world, was founded on the destruction and disposability of us as commodities, right? But within that, right, choosing to live in particular ways or to love in particular ways, right, is very much so a radical politic, because the idea is, in Black feminist circles, we weren't meant to survive, right? And so if we think about it from that particular capacity, intentionally choosing to live, but to live in specific ways that produce, that transform, and that generate new ways of thinking, of being, of existing and interacting, is very much so, particularly for Black queer folks. Because we shouldn't want to exist, right? We're socialized and conditioned that if you don't perform, right, your Blackness in a very cis heteronormative way, right, then you're disposable, right? And so choosing, in spite of that, refusing that shit and saying, nah, I'm gonna affirm myself in this refusal, right, as we transform and as we think of new and generative ways to live anyway, right? So this idea of living amidst precarity, right, is important, because that's, in my thinking, what pushes us towards these elsewheres that we can truly mobilize and actually actualize in our real lives if we are committed and take seriously this idea of loving with care, not as punitive punishment, right, not as violent submission, right, but as, again, fruitful collaboration.
So I want to pivot just a little bit and talk about higher education and situate care work inside of the academy and the experiential knowledge of Black and other people of color. So we know that anti-Blackness, homophobia, misogynoir, these are all phenomena that are endemic to higher education. And in the wake of the state violence following the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and lesser known deaths of trans folks such as Layleen Polanco and Tony McDade, I think we've all experienced acts of movements towards structural change within our institutions, as well as some, shall we say, performative wokeness, right? What is the role of fields and programs like Black studies, race and ethnic studies, women, gender, sexuality studies, in really advocating for structural change and deeper investments in ending anti-Black racism on our campuses, and really moving and striving, I shouldn't say so much striving, but doing the work of creating brave spaces for marginalized folks that really engenders queer belonging?
I mean, I'll just say that I think that look, I think that all of these sort of interdisciplinary formations, particularly those that emerged out of certain kinds of activists and community work all have a role to play in this. But I think that the role is complicated because of institutionalization, right? And we've experienced, I think, that first wave of institutionalization in the 60s and 70s, and then what the outcomes of that were at a later time period, right? And I don't know if we can literally say that I think that what people envisioned for what Black Studies was supposed to be, and its kind of import to the academy is not exactly how it turned out, right? In a certain kind of way. So I think that part of what I think is that, yes, we have an important role, you know, whether it be kind of Black studies, women and gender studies, et cetera. But we also have to understand that we are institutional actors as well, and to always kind of push back against the ways that we're implicated in these very things that we're trying to do, right? And I think the other thing is ultimately about whether the administration actually, at the end of the day, supports these alternative forms of knowledge, right? Because part of what, and I'm sure that y'all have dealt with this too on your own campuses, but part of what we've tried to do in our departmental formations, and I know we did this both at UT, and we're in the process of doing this at UC Santa Cruz as well, is to teach, right, the institution how to be less institutional in certain kinds of ways around the experiences of queer faculty, Black queer faculty, different folks who are kind of marginalized in this space, right? And part of that, and we don't know how they actually will take it up, but I feel like a lot of my biggest battles have actually been as much within these formations as outside, right? Because within you see the reproduction of notions of merit, right? And notions of you know, what constitutes good work and professionalism and so forth. So it's like, well, do you want the indigenous knowledges or not, right? Because if you want the indigenous knowledges, then that means that's going to have to look a little bit different, right? You know, that might be someone who does come off as slightly unprofessional or whatever, right? But do we want, is that what we actually want, right? And I'm saying that like within ourselves as far as our own internal debates, right, and conversations. So I think those are the things that I would just, you know, absolutely, these formations of knowledge are disruptive. And I think if they weren't, they wouldn't be so policed, right? On the other hand, though, I think it's important not to get complacent and also to understand what I think what the internal battles are between, you know, folks who might just want a nice job at a university, right? You know, and you know, don't want to have to deal with racist white people as their sort of, you know, singular experience in that space, right? Which I think is fine, but that's a level of professionalization and institutionalization that others may not share, right? And I think just kind of working through those tensions and being mindful of them is really critically important. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, so this is always because I've been thinking about this you know, a lot. And you know, when I get on different institutional websites and I see, you know, the kind of same language that's kind of just mass produced across the board, and even this idea of ending anti-Black racism, right? I always struggle and kind of rub up against this idea of that we have the capacity, right, within individual programs, departments, and even institutions to end anti-Black racism, given the foundations that our institutions were built off of. And so, and I especially think about that in connection to, you know, you see a department and they've got some really bold language. And so then another program's like, ooh, let's copy and paste that and take, you know, so then I think about the appropriation and thus over time, the reproduction and the romanticization of the language itself, right? Without the actual structural shifts, changes, pushes that have to accompany intentionally, right, those words, right? Because anybody can put that, you know, that shit on a website, right? But it's like, what are you as a program doing with the space that you have access to, right, to make those changes? And so for me, it's you know, kind of this idea of departments and programs have to be willing to constantly change and evolve, right? And not feel like, oh, we put this language up, or oh, we offer this degree program, or oh, we had a couple of, public lecture events that did. So check, right? We're good to go in terms of what we can do. And I think this gets to the conversation that Dr. Liverman was talking about, is the administrative part, right? Because programs and departments can only do so much. But how are we holding administration accountable? Right? How are we demanding transparency as to what things are happening at the administrative level that therefore trickles down and affects what programs and departments can actually do? And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, right, pushing back against traditional DEI strategies, right, that talk about, prejudice and bias, but they do all of those things from a psychological standpoint, which to me is insufficient, because if we're only working, quote unquote, and this is no disrespect, right? But if we're only working from this psychological standpoint and not bringing in kind of this cultural, right, material, ontological reality that folks are experiencing, we're producing more of the same under language that suggests different. And so, I think about in an individual program or coursework, right, that holds space for, imaginative, nonsensical, irrational, creative discussion. Because for me, it's in those creative spaces that we can introduce our students to new ways to think, to develop new lexicons, and to teach them life skills, rather than kind of preparing them to go out into the quote unquote real world as is. Right? What would it look like for us to introduce our students, right, to the irrational, right, to the impossible, to want to go out into the world and change the world, as opposed to how can I fit within this So again, kind of getting back to Dr. Liverman's presentation of belonging in a completely different way. And I think as professors, as educators, those are things that we have access, that we have the power and the ability to do, while pushing our, our department leaders and our administration, right, to show us the money, quite literally, because a lot of these things aren't going to change. You see DEI programs that don't have no budget, don't have no staff. So it's just like, you say on the website that you care about ending or eliminating anti-Black racism, but I don't see the fruits of that labor, right? So I think there are so many different ways that we could kind of tease out, right, how care can actually be actualized from the administration, right, down to in our individual classrooms with our students.
Right. Thank you for that. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the innovations that come out of our respective fields, right? The idea that I know this is going to sound like a political thing to say, but diversity is a low-hanging fruit, right? To identify the gaps in demographic representation and fill those gaps, that's quite frankly the easiest thing an institution can do. But one of the hardest things an institution can do is acknowledge the sort of intellectual expertise that exists within our disciplines to really move and advance the institution to get to that place that they say they want to be, right? So herein lies that the importance of the B in DEIB, the belonging, right? And I think belonging, that language of belonging, has become quite popular in corporate literature, tethered to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think that the way in which the two of you talk about belonging that emerges from our fields of study is a much more sort of holistic way of engaging placemaking, right? So both of your work questions, right? Safety and security and the role of institutions in facilitating communal care. And Dr. Liverman, I really appreciate how you draw on the framing of belonging as this kind of understanding of its affective and cultural dynamics, right? So as you were talking out, all I was thinking of the sort of Drake song, 0 to 100, right? That there are these desires towards inclusion institutionally, but that can go from 0 to cultural appropriation and fetishization really, really quick, right? So what are some of the lessons and the cautionary tales that you could share? We have a lot of students that are watching now. What are some of the cautionary tales that you could share with students and scholars who are interested in inclusivizing their work and incorporating queer of color analytics into the work that they're doing? But again, zero to cultural appropriation, right? So what can we learn on that journey of doing that kind of work and incorporating those analytics into the work?
Well, I'll say first, right, when we're just kind of talking about, maybe any scholarly or intellectual pursuits someone may have, potentially as well activist pursuits and concerns, is I think that, so much of our Black feminist work in particular, I think this has been less taken up specifically in Black queer studies, but I think that it has, to the extent that Black queer studies relies on Black feminism as its foundation, right? But, for me, it's about a kind of critical reflexivity when you're doing the work, right? And without that, and frankly, that needs to be there even when you're working on quote unquote your own communities, right? In fact, it kind of needs to be there, I feel like even more so, right? Because, because I do think there are a lot of assumptions that, because I'm working on my community, there's certain things that I don't have to engage, ethically and reflexively. I don't think anyone's actually taught this, but I'm saying that, I get a sense of that sometimes when I hear people talking about these questions. So I think that that's like a first thing, right? And I think if you keep that a kind of critical reflexive praxis in what you do, and I think, to make that easier, it's just about like your relations with the work, with the people. Why are you invested in it? What are your political relationships? Yeah, I think that's when it comes to kind of the kinds of problematic incorporation that happens at the level of institutions, and that happens at the level of, let's say, corporations, I have less to offer, because I think that, I've been implicated in those two processes in ways that I didn't even anticipate, right? I think we should never forget that capitalism is so malleable, right? And it seeks to kind of suck everything up into its orbit. And so I think understanding that, I think once again, part of it is about, at a certain point, like a corporation isn't going to sponsor your your freedom dream, right? Now, at a certain point, an institution isn't going to sponsor your freedom dream, right? So I think the question then becomes, we can manipulate and use these spaces, but we have to understand that, there are limits to what that manipulation and use of these spaces can be. And I guess to some extent, like how much change we really can make in these spaces. And I think that gets us back to, and I think that the way that Dr. Hall sort of put my work is around belonging. I really appreciated that. But is it a belonging that's just kind of about inclusion? Or is it a belonging that's kind of asking for a transformation, right? And I think that those are the questions that I would just tell people to always have in their mind. Are you doing are you doing this work because you want proximity to whiteness and hierarchy and privilege, right? Or are you hoping to dismantle that, right? Because you realize that your individual or different people's individual access to those things don't mean a lot at the end of the day, right? And I think those are, and I think that, some, like, I'll ask people sometimes, I'm like, are you trying to disrupt, really? Or do you just kind of want to be the Black person always talking in a space full of white people, right? Like, is it disruption or is it desire, right? And so I think that, keeping those things in mind when you're engaging in this kind of work is what I would just simply say.
Yeah, because I'm thinking on a similar thread. We've been on a similar thread and through way, today. So I'm loving it. Because the first thing that I thought about is, particularly if you're writing about communities that you don't belong to, and even the ones that you do belong to, are you writing about or are you writing with, right? So when I think about, collaborating with, other scholars, right? I consider myself as collaborating with them, right? Drawing from their work to further, all of our work and the kinds of, aspirations and desires that we have as to what this work can do beyond its written form. And often what I have experienced, particularly for, white counterparts in various spaces, is next thing you know, they're picking up Afrofuturism, Afro-pessimism, and I'm looking at them like, oh. Like what is the intention behind, right? And this goes back to, are you trying to disrupt, like Dr. Littman said, or is this just about desire, right? In terms of wanting to be seen as someone that's doing progressive work, but isn't actually living and embodying that outside of the written form. And so asking the question of who are you speaking to and why, but also realizing certain, I don't want to say limits, but more so, I guess, more critical reflexivity as to the kind of the messiness between wanting to address an experience that someone is having, right? And then therefore making assumptions about that experience from your interpretation when you haven't embodied and lived those experiences yourself. So there's kind of like a slippery slope of, if you're wanting to, for instance, to talk about, Black queer communities, right? And you don't identify, right, as Black and or queer, right? Having to ask yourself those hard questions, because I've had non-Black folks come up to me. So does this mean that the work that I'm doing on Martin Luther King and the civil rights, you can do whatever the hell you want to do, right? Like, I'm not telling you to do this or to not do that. I am, encouraging folks to engage actual Black folks' work, right? But do you yourself need to produce Black work? Is that something that you can even do, right? Those are the hard questions that you have to ask yourself, and being transparent. And transparency beyond those, those kitchen statements. I acknowledge as, a white this and that and that and that, and then you move on, and then you make all these assumptions about Blackness and about Black life, and it's just like, where are you getting this from? Like, so for me, being mindful about how you're doing what you're doing really matters. If we're thinking about it from an ethical standpoint, you don't need to identify, perhaps as a Afro pessimist to engage that scholarship, to think earnestly and meaningfully about the ideas that are presented in there and how that informs the work that you're doing, rather than just kind of trying to replicate and do more of that when it's just like, maybe that's not, where you can get down your fancy, right? So definitely, I think it's all about definitely engaging perspectives other than your own, but being mindful to not speak over, to speak for, but to always remember to be speaking with and being in collaboration with is super important, particularly as you're trying to figure out who your scholarly or activist identity actually is.
And that, I think, is a wonderful way to conclude, a nice place to end in our conversation about care and belonging, and the recognition that we are in institutions that comparatively exist with a lot of abundance. And there's a lot of room for more, and there's a lot of desire towards investment in nuance and recognition that Black is not a synonym for people of color. That when we talk about Black communities and we talk about Black studies and the Black radical imagination, we are talking about a very long legacy and lineage of field formation that we are asking institutions to be mindful of and to further invest in. So it's not identity politics, people. We're talking about structural change, right? So with that, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Xavier Liverman, to Dr. Ashley Hall. We're going to take a 30-minute break. Please come back at 3:30, where we will welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Moya Bailey, the coiner of misogynoir. So please come back at 3:30 and we will see you then.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, you can't hear me. Thank you. I was saying all the thank yous. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Great conversation. That was beautiful.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I actually was not expecting there to be as much synergy between our